5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Oh, wait, we're not doing this countdown style. Never mind. Hello and welcome back to Meet Mozart. I'm Angie, that's Mozart, and today we are listing off the top 5 opera composers that you need to know. Now, obviously, there are a few different directions we could have gone in order to put together this list, but we wanted to keep it as objective as possible, and so we've tried to come up with a few metrics that each of these composers has to have met. So number 1, they must have a prolific output in the opera genre. Number 2, they must have made a substantial contribution to the art form. And number 3 is accessibility, meaning that their works have become part of the standard operatic repertoire and are easily found and often programmed with opera companies. So let's get started in chronological order with number 1, George Friedrich Handel. Of the composers on our list, Handel was certainly the most prolific, with over 40 operas to his name. Now, he did sometimes borrow from himself, but still, that is a pretty staggering output. Handel was originally from Germany, and he went to Italy to study the newly blossoming Italian opera scene. After doing so, he returned to Germany and then was sent to London, where he worked under the court of King George I. And in fact, his piece, Zadok the Priest, which was performed at King George's coronation, has been performed at every coronation since. The English aristocracy loved Italian opera. They were fascinated by it, and Handel was the first non-Italian composer to successfully bring Italian opera to England. And in addition to working for the king, he also ran his own opera company and brought in many of the best singers of the time, including Castrati. Now, in terms of accessibility, Handel ranks the lowest on the list, and that's because his works, as well as the works of many other early Italian opera composers, are really only coming back into the standard repertoire scene, and that's because a lot of what's in their style is sort of difficult for modern audiences to connect to. So first of all, a lot of the storylines are pulled from Greek and Roman history and mythology, which we just don't have very much of a connection to these days. And also the style of the music was very different. So this particular style of opera was comprised of recitative, which is more speech-like, but still sung and designed to move the plot forward, as well as da capo arias, which allow us to kind of pause the plot for a moment and just absorb and inhabit the emotional space of the character who's singing. Now, those elements have remained a part of opera for a very long time, but da capo arias in particular can be a little long-winded. It consists of an A section, which is usually just one sentence of text that's repeated over evolving musical material. Then we have a B section, which is new text over slightly different musical material. And then we go back to the A section and we sing it again, and this time we add ornaments to make it more interesting. So for example, Handel's aria Da Tempeste starts off Da Tempeste, and if I wanted to ornament that, maybe I would do Da Tempeste to make it more interesting, give you a little something extra. And as great as that is, and as interesting as it can be to listen to, it can make for a really long evening when you've got a ton of characters and a sort of complex plot, and there's just a lot of these repeated style arias. However, there's a couple things to keep in mind. First of all, when Handel was writing opera, opera was not just a part of the evening's event, it was the evening event. So instead of going out to dinner and then going to see the show, a lot of the aristocracy would have their private booths, and so they would sit and enjoy the show while they ate. And so no one was really in a hurry to go anywhere. It was the social event. Additionally, the singers of that day were very well trained in improvisation, which meant that they always had new and exciting ornaments to offer. So you could essentially go to see the same production every night, but with the singers doing all of these beautiful ornaments, you might have a completely different experience. All right, next. Johannes Chrysostomus Wolfgangus Theophilus Mozart. All right, moving on. Just kidding. When Mozart first began writing his operas, the da capo style was still very popular. However, it began to die out in Mozart's lifetime as part of a German movement to put the drama first and to create music that really supports and brings to life that drama. And this is where Mozart starts to really stand out. In Mozart's music, not only is he using text painting or setting a beautiful emotional mood for an aria or a scene, but he's actually using the music in order to develop the characters. One great example of this is his opera Don Giovanni. Don Giovanni includes characters that are of the nobility, of the aristocracy, and then we also have a lot of characters that are of the servant class. And he distinguishes those characters by giving them different music and giving them different rhythms. So for the nobility, they have longer, more sustained phrases, and the servant class uses patter rhythms, which are quicker and lighter and sort of have an air of frivolity. But before you start to think that Mozart was in any way classist, there's a couple really important things to keep in mind. First of all, up to this time, there were two types of opera. There was the tragic opera, the opera seria, in which lots of people died at the end. And then there was the comedic opera, or the opera buffa, which was light and silly and full of hijinks and fun characters, stock characters, and patter rhythms. So with Mozart, what we see is these two styles starting to combine. So Mozart can tell a really tragic, dramatic, serious story and add elements of comedy into it without taking away from the severity of these situations. In fact, a lot of times they shed a different light on what's been going on in these stories. This also led to a revolution in ensemble writing. Before this time, if you wanted to write an ensemble, you had to basically give the two characters the same text and keep them more or less in the same emotional mood so that it would feel cohesive. But Mozart starts writing ensembles and keeping these distinct musical characteristics in the piece. And so you've got all these different layers of these different characters that are supported by different musical material and having extremely different emotional reactions to a scenario. And this is why Mozart's operas have remained a staple part of the operatic repertoire to this day. All right, up next we have Richard Wagner. So in terms of being prolific, Wagner is one of the lower ones on our list at only 13 operas. However, his impact on the opera scene is incredible. You could almost split the operatic history into before Wagner and after Wagner. As I mentioned before, there was a movement happening in German opera in which the focus needed to be the drama and everything else needed to support that drama. And Wagner is really the pinnacle of that ideology. He took the idea of music drama to the next level with an idea called Gesamtkunstwerk, which means total artwork or universal artwork. This meant bringing all of the art forms together in service of creating the ultimate artistic experience. So that means that from the libretto, which he wrote, to the music that he wrote, in the theater that he built, everything had to be this composite artistic experience that was completely immersive for the audience. And he was so particular about the way that he wanted this done that he wrote several essays talking about how he would achieve these lofty goals. And the results were the following. First of all, music had to be non-stop, meaning that there were no longer going to be breaks between recitative and aria. The music was simply going to flow through and never stop. And this also meant that he had to come up with new harmonies that kept us from feeling like we were landing on a cadence at the end of a piece, but instead just moving us through into the next one, so we never knew where the ending was. This also meant that he used the orchestra to keep the music going during set changes, so there was no break in order to change things and make stage adjustments. He also felt that the music needed to deeply integrate with the storyline, and so he came up with what are called leitmotifs. And this meant that when a character or perhaps an item with a very deep symbolic meaning was introduced onto the story, he would play this theme. And every time that that item gets introduced again, that theme continues to develop and evolve as we learn more and more about that item or that person. He also felt that stories were not just stories, but needed to be based in mythology so that the music could really support the symbolic development of these tales. Additionally, the orchestra needed to be bigger and it needed to be hidden. So when he built his theater, Bayreuth, he actually put the orchestra underneath the stage so that way the audience wouldn't be distracted by watching a violinist bow or anything like that, but that they would be completely immersed in the story. He also increased the size of the orchestra and actually invented some of his own instruments to be performed in his pieces. These changes sent ripples through the operatic world, and it is really hard to find a composer, even to this day, who isn't somehow affected by the things that Wagner did. And during his own time, even the people who disagreed with what he was doing still had to acknowledge the immense impact that they were having. And it wasn't just an impact on the composers or the way that music evolved, but it also changed the way that singers had to sing. These pieces were designed to be performed in a very specific acoustic space that was built for that purpose for these pieces, but they were in such high demand that other opera companies wanted to present them too. And so they took these pieces outside of this perfect acoustic situation and moved them into other opera theaters that weren't set up the same way. And so singers had to start singing louder, and it changed and evolved the way that we even think about opera singing. So even your idea about what it is to be an opera singer that we still have today came from Wagner. Speaking of composers who were opposed to Wagner's artistic revolution, the next on our list is Giuseppe Verdi. Quite prolific at over 30 operas, Verdi was a really interesting composer historically because, first of all, he bridged the gap between the bel canto composers such as Rossini, Bellini, Donizetti, who would all definitely be included on a list of a top 10, and the later Verismo styles. But whether he intended to be or not, he was also the Italian answer to Wagner's new Germanic style. And so instead of placing the emphasis on the drama, Verdi believed that he needed to keep with the Italian way of putting the emphasis on the beautiful vocal line, and that the music and the voice should serve to express the emotions of beautifully written and complex human characters, not mythological ones. Although he uses a lot of similar devices as Wagner, such as introducing a dramatic theme that he then repeats throughout the opera, he doesn't use them to the same ends. So he doesn't continuously evolve them the way that Wagner does. Verdi is also possibly the best of the tune writers on this list. He could create really simple, beautiful melodies that would still give us really deep insights into the character. In fact, probably his best-known aria, La Donna è mobile, was such a catchy tune that he didn't give it to the tenor until the day of the performance because he was afraid that the tenor would sing it, people would get to know it, and then before opening night, everyone would know his song. And this ability to create beautiful, memorable, enjoyable melodies that still gave us great and complex insights into the character are what has made Verdi's operas some of the most standard pieces in our repertoire today. And last but not least, we have Giacomo Puccini. Puccini is the least prolific on our list with only 12 operas. He also is one of the least innovative in terms of his contributions to the art forms, but he knew how to really effectively use the music in order to make us feel a story, and that is why his works are some of the most accessible and regularly programmed pieces in the entire repertoire. He used a lot of the same devices as Verdi and Wagner, such as introducing a theme and then reiterating that theme throughout the course of the opera. but he had a gift for melody that was similar to someone like Verdi. However, he used a lot of the ideas of Wagner in creating a more continuous flow throughout the opera. And so we see him really integrating these ideas and bringing them into the service of telling the story and still getting a lot of beautiful singing. He also based his operas on a lot of stories that were from around the globe. And so you get to hear elements of the styles from Japan all the way to the American West. All right, so that's our list of the top 5 opera composers that you need to know. We hope you found it helpful. Obviously, it's just a starting place. There are so many great composers, ones that we hope to do lots of videos on in the future, but in the meantime, go ahead and dive down that YouTube rabbit hole. But before you do, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, push all the fun buttons, including that little notification bell so you don't miss our next video. And we will see you next time. Bye. The next composer on our list is Wolfgang Johannes Chrysostomus. We'll start that.